pried a half-burned vellum from between mortar and carved stone and felt suspicion tighten his hands. The edge of the sheet flaked under his thumb. Ink that once mapped curves
Elias,
of a vault
put it back
smeared
in.
into a black
It's too
streak.
dangerous.
He spoke without
It's
looking
already
up.
safe,
This is not
Matthias.
accidental.
Shouldn't be
The word
here,
hung
Mara.
while twilight cut the cathedral fire aid into
Pact
hard
is broken,
lines.
Alaric.
Elias
We
moved
need
the vellum
answers.
to the brazier in his satchel. He did not trust wind. He kept the lamp low and the brazier cold. He traced one surviving line with a gloved finger, and the pattern suggested a circle set not for buttresses but for placements, marks for people, not beams. Suspicion drove him to test the obvious first. Where had an interior ring been removed and why? He had studied stone and ritual for 25 years. Dre. Elias Marrow held a battered signet, a brass compass, and a notebook full of margin notes in a hand that never stopped measuring. He had taught at the provincial seminary and been refused a chair for asking questions about icon placement in choir vaults. He smelled candle wax and old glue. He tasted iron from a cut 2 days earlier. He was a measured man, but the vellum made him move in ways that revealed urgency rather than patient curiosity. They met in the nave under the navish-shadowed alcove. Marta Voss stood by a table of rolled drafts. Lucien Thorne set a lamp between them and watched Elias with collused palms. Elias laid the charred fragment flat. Marta, Elias, look at this. Marta lifted the vellum with 2 fingers and did not flinch. Her palms were practiced. Lucien, tell me what those marks mean. Elias tapped the line that divided a drawn semicircle from a smaller ring. Marta held the vellum close. These are ritual placements, she said, not scaffolding. Her voice was low, precise. I have catalogue entries for geometry, but never like this. She set the scrap down and reached for a ledger. Lucien leaned over. They ordered plans burned before. He asked, who burns plans? Guilds don't do that unless... He stopped. He did not finish the sentence. Elias felt doubt creep in, and then shift under him to anger. He controlled his hands by closing them around the compass. The burn marks are too neat, he said. Edges were singed on purpose. Someone culled drafts over months. He named the guild by implication, a method, not accident. Marta placed the ledger alongside the vellum. Ledger entries show payments for material disposal on 3 nights, she said. Dates matched drafts missing from the archive. She flipped pages with a rustle. Listen. Masters are lessoned and Hiran paid scribes 20 days after each consecration. That could be routine, or it could be a cover. Her jaw tightened. The first external event arrived in the form of a scraped boot on stone. Steward Aldrich's shadow filled the alcove doorway. He stepped in carrying a key ring and the authority it represented. His cloak tasted of cold linen and damp. He did not smile. Dear Marrow, Aldrich, you make a habit of disturbing the nave at dusk. He lifted a brow. What are you doing with cathedral property? His tone was thin and formal. He kept the ledger at arm's length. Elias, we are examining a fragment. There is evidence of destroyed drafts. This implicates the guild. He watched Aldrich's fingers close on a single ring of keys. Aldrich tilted his head. Accusations are heavy. Do you have proof? He looked at Marta and then at Lucien, as if measuring their readiness to corroborate Elias. Lucien put the lamp between them and, without raising his voice, said, We were going to ask you, steward. The archive shows missing sheets. His phrase carried pressure. He spoke Lucien's name aloud to keep control. Aldrich, did you sanction disposal? Aldrich's features hardened. No. The chapter decides such matters. He tapped a ledger with a gloved finger. If you make claims, show the chapter. Otherwise you risk false accusations. He stepped toward the door and left them with the cold air of warning. They tested a foundation seam that night. Lucien removed a flagstone by hand despite the risk of noise. He worked with a crowbar and sweating forearms. The seam gave. Under the flagstone, mortar had been smoothed and then patched unevenly. Elias ran his palm over the seam and felt a false plane. Tools that shaped stone had been used to conceal a cavity. They removed something here, he said. They altered load, bearing geometry. Marta shone a lamp into the hole. Inside, charcoal flecks and burned vellum dust clung to the mortar like dried paste. There was a chamber, she said. Someone sealed it carefully. The tool marks are deliberate. She scraped with a thin blade and extracted a sliver of soot that bore glyph traces. She did not breathe the dust. They carried the evidence back to the alcove. The second external event arrived when someone shouted from the chapter house corridor. A voice called for Aldrich. Footsteps receded. The shout acted as a reminder that they were under observation. Elias paced while Marta arranged the sliver on a white plate. He spoke with clipped sentences. If the pattern maps to people and positions, then the removed chamber could have contained an altar or a ring for enactments. He tapped the glyph, not structural geometry, liturgical geometry. That changes motive, the word motive like a scalpel. Marta looked up. Why hide liturgy? She asked. The masters would have control if they were preparing rites not sanctioned by chapter law. They'd burn plans to erase culpability. Her mouth stayed flat. Her hands moved quickly. Lucian frowned. You think they burned the drafts to hide a ritual? He asked. But who among the masters would risk establishing a hidden order here? He set the lamp down slowly. Named them. They planned to consult the archives at first light, but the third external event changed their timeline. Late that night, Elias found a ruined drafting room under the choir while following the scent of smoke. The door hung open and smoldered papers littered the floor. Someone had recently torn plans from tables and dragged them into a brazier. A figure stood at the far table in a hood. Elias advanced. Stop. He placed his hand on the table. The hood swung back and a face glared in ember light. Aldrich, you should not be here. Aldrich, this place is secured. His voice carried the sound of command. He seized a bundle of papers and shoved them toward the brazier. Elias reached and grabbed. Those are evidence. He pulled a sheet from the brazier's edge. Flames licked one sigil and then took it. Elias snatched a still, uncharted fragment. You burned them on purpose. Aldrich did not answer with proof. Instead he barked. You interfere with guild procedure, and you will be charged with trespass. Put that down. He moved to close the door. Lucian charged from the stair and lunged for the brazier. Hands collided. A stack of papers flipped into flame. Marta shoved between them and grabbed Elias' wrist. They argued in rapid, clipped lines. Aldrich, stop. Lucian, you cannot destroy historical records. He tried to wrench a burning sheet away. Aldrich pushed back. These are not for the archive. Step back. He touched Lucian's arm with enough force to bruise. Marta snapped. Show us the chapter minutes. Show the orders. Her voice did not tremble, or answer why these sheets were singled out. She had 3 quick retorts and she used them all. Elias pulled away holding a charred corner. The paper broke and a triangular glyph fell into his palm. He did not look at Aldrich. This glyph, he said, it was a placement marker. They burned the plans because the placements were for people and not pillars. He shoved the glyph into his notebook with a shaking hand. Doubt shifted to fear when Aldrich whispered, people are safer when some things are forgotten. He closed the door behind him and left them amid smoke and a new urgency. They fled to a makeshift study beside a cold brazier in the crypt. Marta spread drawings on a wooden bench. Lucian held a lamp over the plans. Elias pinned the charred fragment with a coin and began to redraw the surviving lines. We need correlation, Marta. If that triangular mark matches the keystone pattern, then the ring was used for a ceremony. She spoke fast and precise. We must find where a keystone shows altered carving. They slipped into small, fast exchanges. Keystone in the south transept, Lucian. Its carving is recent, different stone. Tooling not in the master records. He pointed to a ledger photograph. Here. See the tool marks. He tapped the page. Marta rubbed her thumb across a recorded invoice. There are records of stone replacement after a settling event, but none of the replacements record ritual quarrying. Someone billed the master coffer under repairs and paid a stonemason who is otherwise unrecorded. She made a quick calculation. 2 men, paid late. That is suspicious in itself. Elias paused and then returned to a line on the charred vellum. He tapped it and said, the placement ring intersects with a faint compass mark here. Whoever designed this intended alignment. This is deliberate liturgy designed to intersect light, sound, and human placement. He looked at Marta. If we prove alignment, we prove intent. They moved outside at pray. Dawn to the chapter house. The 4th external event arrived in the form of confrontation. Aldrich awaited them in the meeting room with 2 other stewards. His posture matched the office he held. He folded his hands and did not rise due to marrow. Aldrich, the chapter heard you were making allegations. Speak plainly or be dismissed. His voice carried the distance of corridors. Elias put the charred glyph on the table. We found this in a patched seam. We found ledger entries showing payments to remove drafts. We found drafts burned in a drafting room. We think masters conspired to erase ritual placements. We want to know why. He kept his voice steady. Aldrich swallowed and then offered a brusque denial. No guildmaster sanctioned such an act. If you have evidence, you must produce it before the chapter. Otherwise you risk defamation. He slid a turned page toward Marta. Marta slid the ledger copy forward. These are payments labeled material disposal. They coincide with nights after consecration. The amounts match apprentice wages for burning and salvaging. Aldrich, these are ledgers from your custody. Her gaze held his. Aldrich's jaw tightened. He tapped the ledger with a single finger. The entries refer to waste clearing. That is normal. Nothing here ties directly to ritual concealment. He tried to steer the obligation back to formalities. Lucian's voice hardened. You can't make the ledger mean nothing. Someone listed names and payments. Read them aloud, Marta. He pushed on the pressure point. Marta read, paid to Hiran's man, paid to a lessons assistant, paid to, for disposal of irregular sheets. She did not raise her voice. She let the words land. The room shifted. Aldrich's face flickered. You misread ledger shortened. The chapter uses phrases for irregular work often. You are twisting context. He stood. If you persist, there will be consequences for trespass and fomenting unrest among the guild. He left the room in a way that suggested both warning and retreat. They watched him go. The group turned inward. The fifth external event took the form of a small, decisive discovery. Lucian found a charred diagram inside a mortar seam that matched the triangular glyph Elias had bagged. He set it on the table and the lines aligned. This maps to ritual placements, Elias, not scaffolding. The triangle marks the efficient stand. Circles mark 12 positions. Someone designed a circle for people to move through. He drew a quick line connecting the two fragments. Marta's fingers tapped the table. If the ring was removed and replaced by false load, bearing geometry, then the masters erased the evidence and hid the chamber. The payments show who paid to hide it. She the word hide with a cold clarity. Doubt shifted again and fear grew sharper. They no longer argued only about the evidence. They argued about exposure. If we take this to the chapter, they'll bury it. Lucian, if we go public, the guild will retaliate. He rubbed his jaw. What if they target us? Elias put his hand over the charred glyph. The physical weight of the paper steadied him. We reconstruct quietly. We must rebuild the language from what remains. We must map the stones. He tapped his signet. I will not let them erase this without a record. They moved to the ruined drafting room beneath the choir to intervene before a planned burning. The sixth external event arrived as the clandestine conclave in the ruined drafting room. They stumbled into conspirators, dragging the final blueprints toward flame. Hooded figures encircled the brazier. A torch burned a last unblemished sheet. Elias lunged forward. Stop! He shouted. A cloak turned. A hand seized the torch. Marta pushed past a conspirator and snatched for the bundle. Lucian shoved a man away from the brazier. Voices rose in quick exchanges. You are wrong to be here! A cloaked voice hissed. This is the guild's decision. Another voice said, destroy them now or all of us suffer. The phrases were short and jagged. Elias grabbed a sheet and pulled. The paper caught and ripped. A sigil ignited and flared. Embers jumped onto a sleeve. Marta slapped at the sparks. Lucian shoved a conspirator back and drew a hidden knife in reflex. Hands closed around wrists. Aldrich stepped into the center and with a single move shoved them aside and forced the brazier free to breathe. A burning sigil flashed in the embers. For a single instant the design showed clearly. Concentric rings with marks for positions and a central triangle. The design spoke the same placement language as the charred fragment Elias held. Marta swore and struck her palm on the table. Someone pulled a torch down the corridor. Steps thundered. The seventh external event and arrival made them scatter. Conspirators moved to block exits. Elias shoved a brazier off balance to obscure the sigil with smoke. He grabbed a remaining scrap and shoved it into his satchel. Lucian pulled Marta toward a side stair and they fled to the crypt entrance. They reached the crypt with ragged breaths and concrete urgency. Dawn bled light across stone steps. Elias emptied his satchel and found only one triangular glyph intact and a smear of ash with a partial ring. He pressed the glyph to light and then to the page of his notebook. Marta set a workbench by the crypt mouth and began to redraw lines with steady hands. Lucian checked the door. He listened for footsteps and for the absence of them. They spoke in rapid phrases to coordinate next steps. We must reconstruct the language from these shapes. Alias, we need measurements of keystones in voices. and a record of replacements. He tapped a ledger with 2 fingers, find masons named in the payments. Track who signed receipts. Marta nodded. I will extract the detailed ledgers and cross-check quarry records. She folded a small lamp and set it near the glyph. I will not let the chapter claim ignorance. Lucien clasped his hands on the table. What about Aldrich? He asked. He pushed us away. He knew the burning. He stood by while they destroyed evidence. He the name aloud and let it land. Elias lifted the glyph and scanned the carved line under lamp. His voice was quieter now, but the resolve in it had sharpened. Aldrich is a steward of process. He covers the process. I suspect collusion among masters. We find them by ledger, payment, and changed stone. We force the record back into light. He closed his fingers on the glyph like a promise. They spent the next hours mapping the cathedral with quick measurements and blunt tools. They recorded the keystone dimensions, the distance between columns, the actual alignment to the rose window. Each measurement yielded a new question. Each variable required another check. They moved fast and with coordinated purpose. The mini cliffhanger arrived when Lucien unearthed archival photos of the consecration that showed a master carving absent from later lists. The image offered a face and a name. Heron's assistant appears in this photograph, Lucien, but Heron denies involvement in trade with unrecorded masons. Why is he in a photo if he paid men off? He tapped the image until it bent. Marta leaned over. If Heron appears in the consecration and then disappears in official lists after repairs, then someone removed his trace. That means the collusion includes record tampering. She looked up. This changes everything. Doubt moved into a new mode. Betrayal. They no longer suspected only abstract concealment. They now suspected named masters of deliberate erasure and manipulation. The sense that the guilds protected themselves at the cost of truth hardened the group's intent. They agreed to an operational split. Marta would exhume ledger entries from the chapter house with excuses. Lucien would trace the stonemason who received the repairs payment. Elias would catalogue the glyphs and map them against stone replacements. They spoke the plan in short lines. Marta, you take the ledgers. Elias, Lucien, you find the mason. I will meet with the corestone supplier under pretense of an inspection. He kept the sentences clear and concrete. Marta nodded. I will make copies. I will not be seen. She wrapped her hands in cloth. If I am stopped, leave the ledger with Lucien. He knows how to read the shortened. Her words were a small, sharp order. They parted before noon. Elias walked the cathedral, touching stone faces and tapping keystones with his knuckle. The final external event, clandestine burning, had cost them their direct proof. Yet in the ash and scorch marks they found a trace. A scorch pattern repeated in 3 places where stone had been replaced. The scorch pattern aligned with the triangular glyph. Back at the crypt entrance, Elias picked up a single scorched glyph he had salvaged earlier. He pressed it into his notebook and felt the spine of pages under his palm. The glyph was small but specific, a triangle flanked by 2 short arcs. It fit into a drawn ring the way a missing puzzle piece might, but here the piece carried intent. Elias closed the notebook and met Marta and Lucien at the mouth of the crypt. They stood close, faces lit by a low lamp and filtered dawn. He put the notebook on the bench and said, "We will reconstruct the missing language from this and the stone. We will name those who burned the plans. We will take records that cannot be burned." Marta rested her palm on the ledger she had smuggled. If the chapter resists, we expose names with masons' receipts and invoice chains. Paper can be burned, but receipts given to lay suppliers leave traces in other hands. She tapped a page, files spread across trades. Lucien looked to the west transept and then back to Elias. If they move against us, we bury copies in places they will not check. We trade proof for proof. He folded his hands into a fist and then let them open. I will not let them erase this. Elias took the scorched glyph from his sleeve and placed it on the bench. He did not speak of destiny or fate. He did not promise vague resolve. He set a clear, physical task. We rebuild from stone and ink. We map every altered keystone and cross-match invoices. We will find Heron's chain. If necessary, we file claims in the bishop's court with the copies Marta keeps. He pushed the glyph into his satchel and closed it. They did not celebrate. They did not make speeches. They began to move. Marta to the chapter house with ledger copies hidden under a shawl, Lucien toward the mason quarters downriver, Elias to the transept to measure keystones again. Each step was a decision made visible by action. At the crypt mouth, a bell struck the hour. Someone in the chapter house answered with a shuttered window. Elias put on his thin leather gloves, tapped his signet, and told the others, "But tonight we follow the invoices. We meet where the stonemason keeps his ledger." He looked at Marta and Lucian. "Marta, bring the glyph. Bring the compass. If they confront you, speak of repairs. Leave nothing to claim." Her voice was small and immovable. Lucian cracked a small grin that did not reach his eyes. "We will begin at dusk." They moved out under a sky that showed no grand meaning. Only the practical ledger of time and a new oath executed in the cold. Elias slid the scorched glyph into his pocket and felt its folded edge pressing into his palm. He did not think of heroism. He thought of ledger lines, of ruined drafts, and of a circle of people who had once stood where the stone now sat. He sealed the notebook and led them up the steps. The chapter closed behind them like a door, but the glyph inside his satchel remained a concrete, tangible claim. They had salvaged a single mark from ash and chosen to make that mark a record. The final paragraph closes with a concrete action. Elias thrust the single scorched glyph into his notebook and announced they would reconstruct the language from ash and stone. He stepped over the threshold and saw Matthias Kurz hold a sheet to the flame. The vellum curled and blackened around the edges. Suspicion tightened Elias Marrow's hands. Suspicion had sent him here after dusk. He lunged forward and dragged the sheet from the ember before it turned to ash. Elias smelled smoke and hot glue of ink as he flattened the half-charred page on the workbench. The ink bled along drawn ribs of a vault. Some lines were deliberately scraped away. "This was not accidental," he said, voice low and abrupt. The line forced the conflict into the room. Someone had been burning plans. He did not stand still. Elias took out his magnifier and pressed it to the vellum. He tapped the brass ring at his finger, a habit when deciding. The magnifier revealed a sequence of clipped marks along the margin, ritual annotations, not repair notes. He kept his hands steady but his jaw clenched. The first emotion shift moved suspicion into anger. A sound in the doorway made him look up. Matthias froze, face flushed by firelight. "You should not be here, Matthias." His voice was thin. Elias set the vellum down between them and spoke without flourishes. "Matthias, why burn plans?" "Elias." He named the act plainly to pin the moment. The question hung while Matthias's eyes shifted to the hearth. Matthias jabbed a thumb at the coals. "Orders," he said simply. He did not meet Elias's gaze. The answer widened the mystery and created a clear external obstacle: higher authority. Elias stepped closer to the hearth, watching the flames lick a stack of half-done sketches. He moved his gloved hand over his satchel and felt the folded half-sheet he had pried out of the cathedral wall the week before. He thought of that earlier find, the half-burned vellum stuck between mortar and carved stone, ink smeared into a black streak. An event that had already shifted his work from curiosity to pursuit. Brother Vale's whisper the next day had told him not every scrap was accidental. Matthias shifted again, hands working as if to rearrange something on the bench. Elias named the next movement aloud. "Who gave orders?" he asked. Slow. Matthias' mouth opened, closed, and then he said, "I have no name." He spoke the lie quickly and eyes darted. Ansel, a young mason, pushed in from the cold way of apprentices, stepped in carrying a sealed billet. He moved like someone who had been trained to look down while delivering objects. The arrival forced the next event. The room tightened. Ansel set the billet on the table and stamped his boots. "For Matthias," he said, and did not look at Elias. He left a faint smear of soot along the edge of the wood. The sealed paper had a folded seal pressed into wax, and the chapter's device impressed faintly. Elias reached for the billet with a measured movement, and Brother Vale's shadow filled the doorway. Vale did not enter all the way. He only allowed his presence to be known. He stepped forward when Elias motioned him closer. Elias slid the billet under his cuff and felt the weight of the seal beneath the cloth. "Brother Vale, Elias," using the name to anchor the scene. "Open it." The second emotion shift nudged suspicion toward urgency. Elias needed proof now. Vale moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had taken vows. He eased the wax and pried the seam. The paper inside was blank on one side and scrubbed on the other. Where ink should have sat, the surface bore deliberate scraping and a faint residue of soot. Near the edge, someone had drawn a simple sigil in iron gall and then tried to erase it with a knife. Vale exhaled once and did not speak. His index finger traced the scraped margin without touching the glyph. They are erasing their handwriting. Elias. He hit fast enough to sound like accusation. Matthias barked a laugh that went nowhere. We were told to remove anything that could be read by outside hands, he said. And the sentence revealed obedience rather than initiative. Ansel shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His knuckles were white around the billet. Elias's palm found the magnifier chain and he held it up to the bulb. Under the lens, the scraped letters formed a pattern of numbers and compass points. Elias's mind raced to fit those marks into vault geometry. He felt the pull toward reconstruction, the kernel of his work, move from a theoretical exercise into a direct confrontation with someone else's secrecy. The lodge smelled of tar, tallow, and old mortar. Workmen's tools lay on benches like scattered bones. Elias again, names, who in the chapter ordered the purge. Matthias avoided the question and kicked a stool. You are making trouble, Elias Marrow, he said. Sister Elodia watches. The name landed heavy. It supplied a person and a motive. Sister Elodia's presence expanded the problem from anonymous erasure to institutional direction. Vale touched Elias's sleeve and leaned in. You should leave, Vale. His voice was low. The warning had a tremor. Elias recognized the sound of someone balancing loyalty and fear. You will make them look harder. The line forced Elias to weigh choices. Elias shook his head once. Vale, I already found a scrap in the wall. I have to know what they are removing. He spoke with deliberate speed so that his resolve would not be interrupted. Vale's eyes slid toward the hearth. A noise at the outer door announced footsteps with the cadence of someone running. The latch clicked and Canon Rocher appeared in the entry, cloak still damp from the courtyard. He looked at Elias like a judge who had not yet decided the charge. The arrival created a sudden escalation. The lodge had become a public place. Elias Marrow, Canon Rocher without preamble. What is the meaning of this intrusion? His voice carried authority and a readiness to punish. Elias placed the vellum on the bench and met Rocher's gaze. Canon Rocher, I found them burning plans. This vellum was pulled from a vault wall. I demand to know who ordered this. Elias kept his sentences short and direct. Rocher's eyes narrowed. You will not make accusations in my lodge, he said. Leave now, or I will have you bound for the chapter house. His tone forced the confrontation outward toward the institution's formal power. Elias felt anger swell again, now sharp with the knowledge of risk. He looked at Brother Vale. Vale's fingers closed quickly on Elias's sleeve in a small, decisive grip. Vale nothing, but his hand tightened and then released. The silent act was an emotional change, trust given in small contact. Ansel shifted to the hearth and, without a word, tossed the sealed billet into the flames. The wax hissed and cracked. All heads turned when the paper curled and blackened. The action took away the last direct thread of paper evidence in the room and produced the mid-chapter cliffhanger. Elias lunged for the billet, but the flames took it. No, Elias. Rocher stepped forward. You have disobeyed Ansel, he said. You will answer to the chapter. His voice implied immediate consequences. Ansel lowered his head and did not speak. The external event that followed, the destruction of the billet, forced Elias to improvise. Vale moved to the bench and slid the half-charred ledger pages toward Elias with a deliberate hand. We found these scraped in a chest, Vale. He set a scorched book down and tapped it with a finger. Someone went through them and ground the ink away. The ledger itself offered new concrete evidence. Elias opened the book and found entries where names had been ground to the point of fragmentary letters. Between the lines, someone had added small sigils in an even hand. Elias ran his thumb along a page and felt the raised score of a cut where ink had been removed. He recognized the cuts as purposeful censorship rather than time-worn decay. The discovery shifted Elias's emotion toward a cold clarity. This was coordinated erasure. Canon Rocher watched him with a face like flint. You will drop this, Rocher, for the safety of the workman and the chapter. The sentence exposed the chapter's stated reason. Safety. Elias pushed back by pressing the ledger closer to Rocher. Safety for whom? Elias, not for the vaults, not for the arches that were meant to speak. He spoke the last words as if naming a theft. Rocher's jaw tightened. Matthias slammed a hand on the bench. We do as we are told. Matthias, we are masons, not judges. The argument produced a short, fast back and forth. Elias accusingly naming intent, Matthias deflecting with duty, Rocha reminding of order, 3 quick exchanges that clarified each man's stakes. Elias left the lodge that night with cold fingers and a single scorched ledger leaf in his satchel. He met Brother Vale in the cloister corridor and they moved down into the archive beneath the nave. The early morning light cut narrow bars across dust and stone. The shift from the lodge to the archive moved the plot into a deeper search. In the archive, Elias knelt and pried a base stone loose where water had been tracked between joints. He pushed the stone aside and exposed a shallow cavity. Vale held a lantern steady. The light revealed a half-carved glyph on the exposed face and a folded note tucked beneath. The note bore a careful script in a hand he recognized, a secretary's neat looped letters. The external discovery exposed the chapter's hand. Elias unfolded the note with gloves and the script read, "Purge drafts of dangerous geometry. Destroy any layouts that map secret bearing points. Conceal radial keystones." The order was specific and used operative language tied to construction rather than theology. Sister Elodia's name did not appear on the page, but the seal matched chapter dispatches Elias had seen before. The twist changed his understanding. The erasure was ordered not by an outside zealot, but by the chapter's own authority. Vale folded the stone back over the cavity and did not speak for several heartbeats. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with a single finger. The small gesture showed resignation. They think the plans are dangerous. Vale finally not dangerous for the building, Elias. Dangerous for a story the chapter does not want told. The line supplied motive, control of narrative. Elias pressed the ledger leaf and the half-charred vellum into his notebook and strapped the satchel closed. He felt the third emotion shift. From urgent clarity to a hard resolve, he would map the absence. He would treat the missing lines as evidence, not as silence. The decision led him to attempt to secure more fragments. The courtyard intercepted him next. Matthias and Ansel lay in wait, and a scuffle followed. Ansel moved quick and young, grabbing at Elias's satchel. Matthias shoved forward with the blunt force of a man trained in physical labor. Elias had his glove on and reached under coat to pull a tucked scrap free before their hands reached it. Neither man used weapons. The fight was hands and cloth and the scrape of stone. Elias felt breath burn in his throat and he smelled the copper tang of a nick on his palm. He pushed past them and ran to the western gate. Outside, the chapter's enforcers appeared by the east wall and a dozen workmen watched from a distance. Brother Vale caught up to him in the lane and took the satchel without ceremony. "We cannot keep all of it, Vale." He folded the single charred scrap into a sleeve and gave Elias a nod like a command. "You will take that and leave the rest to me." The exchange showed Vale taking decisive action that shifted the course of events. Elias did not argue. He nodded and moved to a shadowed alley where he could examine the scrap properly. Inside the scrap was a faint glyph, half a radial pattern with a tiny dot where a keystone might bear weight. The mark matched the raised carving found under the archive stone. The matching sign confirmed that the chapter's erasure targeted specific geometry in the cathedral. Night fell and Elias watched from a stair as cloaked figures entered the vaulted crypt at midnight. He had followed them once before to a different place. Now curiosity had sharpened into pursuit. The chapter conclave had the manner of a ritual. Members arranged around a ruined drafting table, candles guttering, a pile of vellum smoldering. Elias slipped between a pillar and an arch and kept to the stone. He was careful to breathe shallowly. Sister Elodia moved among the figures with a steady step. Canon Rocha read aloud from a parchment, and then with a knife dripped hot wax onto the vellum. Elias watched the words and could not make them out entirely, but he understood the actions. The chapter was performing an ordered destruction. Brother Vale stood at the edge of the ring and did not join them. He watched with an expression Elias could not rid. The scene built toward the climax. Matthias fed papers into a brazier and they burned clean. Ansel stood with head bowed. Elias stepped forward when a sigil flared while being consumed. The flare was small and orange, as if the suit had a reaction to the flame. He reached for a scrap and was grabbed roughly by 2 hands. "Stop him, Sister Elodia." Her voice was level and absolute. The voice justified the chapter's force in a single syllable. A short, rapid exchange broke out. Ilias demanding to know why, Sister Elodia ordering restraint, Canon Rocher commanding silence, Vale trying to pull Elias away. You will not pry into what keeps us safe. Sister Elodia. Elias met her eyes. Safe for whom? Elias again, those stones were meant to speak. The line forced the moral question into the open. Sister Elodia moved close enough that he could see carved lines of age at the corners of her mouth. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she pressed the heel of a palm against a glowing page and let it blacken fully. The action answered the demand with destruction. Vale slipped a blade into Elias's palm and jabbed him lightly to force compliance. The silent cue meant that Vale would aid Elias's escape, but not openly defy the chapter that night. The moment was a pivot. Elias felt hands yank him backward, and a boot push him to the edge of the circle. He stumbled out into the crypt's cold, where Caecilian damp hit his coat. The climax had been reached. He had seen the purge and been overwhelmed. Outside the crypt, the air was raw and his breath came hard. Brother Vale met him on the steps and clasped him by the shoulder. You have what you can carry, Vale. We will keep another piece hidden. Vale's voice had the weight of someone who had chosen complicity for a purpose. Elias felt relief and betrayal in the same beat, an emotion shift from outrage to reluctant alliance. They walked down a long stair into dusk and sat on the stone steps outside the cathedral. Elias opened his satchel and smoothed the single charred fragment flat between gloved fingers. The glyph was smudged but legible enough to show a curve with a tiny node. Elias turned it toward Vale. This ties to the base stone we found, Elias. His words were crisp and factual. Vale nodded and then reached into his robe to remove a small key with a chapter mark. You will make copies. Vale, you will map the missing lines. But you will not speak of the names you cannot prove. The sentence set the terms of their alliance. Elias folded the scrap into the satchel and strapped it closed. He felt the weight of choice. He had exposed the chapter's program of erasure. He had seen the conclave and held evidence. The last paragraph reached toward a concrete situational beat rather than reflection. He eased the satchel onto his shoulder and let Brother Vale lift the loosened base stone back into place. Together they sealed the cavity over the glyph and walked away with the single charred fragment between them. Elias flung the lodge door wide and snatched the vellum from Matthias's fingers before the flame could take it. Suspicion drove him forward. His hands atched with the same tightness that had pushed him through the cathedral mortar months earlier when he found a scorched sheet wedged in between carved stone. The brazier hissed. Two cloaked masons reached as Elias closed his fingers around the corner of vellum and pulled it back, the ink blistering at the edge where the heat had already eaten into the lines. He did not speak at once. He pressed the sheet flat on the drafting table and muttered as he brushed soot from a marginal note. Suspicion, not certainty, made him demand answers with short, sharp motions. Matthias, he said, holding the vellum between two gloved fingers. What was burning? Matthias Kurz took a step back, the brazier light stroking his forehead. He smelled of smoke and wet wool. We were doing what the lodge required, Matthias answered, voice cracking on the last word. He kept his hands where Elias could see them. It had to go. Outside the lodge, someone shifted on the stone stairs. The locked door had been forced earlier. Elias had wrenched it open with his shoulder. That forced entry mirrored the earlier night when he had pried a half-charred draft from cathedral mortar and thought the hand that hid it must be deliberate, not clumsy. The room now held a different certainty. Fragments were being destroyed on purpose. Elias set the vellum on the table and leaned over the drawing. The ink had become a blackened crust at one edge, but across the center a faded radial arc remained, interrupted by smoke stains. He tapped the brass ring on his finger and traced the curve with a fingertip. This is geometry, he said, not random ornament. Matthias swallowed. We burned others. Master Aldrich ordered the rest gone last week. The lodge could not bear the burden. Elias's jaw tightened. He had found charred plans before. He had watched Matthias hold a sheet over a brazier in a prior meeting and force it toward flame until Elias pulled it away. That earlier theft of a fragment had led him here tonight. Suspicion shifted into anger as he demanded names. Who else saw them? The cloaked masons remained near the brazier, faces hidden by hoods. One of them, a wide-shouldered man with soot on his knuckles, answered in a low voice, Aldrich. 2 stewards. We burned when instructed. Elias moved around the table and found Jonas crouched at the far side, fingernails ink smudged, pale under the hood. Jonas's hands trembled as he handled a small folded scrap. Elias noticed the apprentice's eyes dart toward a gap beneath the drafting table, toward a line of mortar that had been tampered with earlier. Elias ordered, "Show me what you have, Jonas." Jonas hesitated and then slipped a hand under the table. He produced a charred strip of vellum, edges curled, a tiny star map fragment creased in the center. When Elias straightened, the apprentice said, "I hid this before they came. I thought I could save something." Elias placed the strip beside the larger sheet. The fragment contained part of a radial pattern that, when aligned with the arc on the rescued vellum, hinted at a keystone geometry arranged around a central point. The 2 pieces clicked in his mind like matched teeth. Suspicion shifted toward clarity. Elias now saw method where he had seen only hasty destruction. He whispered, "They are not burning drafts. They are erasing a program." Footsteps like measured hammer strokes echoed from the corridor. The lodge door opened and Guild Master Aldrich entered with 2 stewards flanking him, faces taut. He wore the lodge chain over a wool coat, the metal catching brazier light. Aldrich's voice was steady when he spoke. "Matthias, why is there an unauthorized gathering?" Matthias stepped forward, lifting the brazier slightly. "Aldrich, dear." Marrow forced the door and seized a sheet. "He says it's part of the blueprint." "We were destroying the drafts as ordered." Aldrich looked at Elias and then at the half-burned sheet on the table. "Drew." "Marrow," he said, short and cold, "you have no place here after hours. Leave the materials. We will dispose of them properly." Elias rested both palms on the table and kept his voice controlled. "Aldrich, I have found carved markers beneath the foundation. I have letters that mention a circular keystone and a pattern in the vault. Why are you burning plans that match carved elements?" He produced the earlier charred fragment he had recovered from the cathedral mortar and set it next to the lodge vellum. Aldrich's mouth tightened. He glanced at the stewards, then at Matthias. "For the safety of the lodge," he said, "and for the cathedral. There are orders from above." The room contracted. Silence folded over the group like a pressed cloth. Jonas's shoulders hunched. Matthias's hands left the brazier rim. The cloaked masons shifted their weight. Aldrich placed a palm on the table and looked at each man. "We will do what must be done." Elias felt the first of 2 swift emotion shifts, suspicion to indignation. He could smell burnt vellum and wet stone and something else, authority enforcing erasure. He rose on a small movement and said, "You are erasing evidence. You are altering what the building will say to those who come after us." His voice did not rise. He spoke with exact, brief syllables. Aldrich's reply came without preamble. "The way the cathedral functions with the ritual would be misunderstood outside our circle. It is dangerous." Elias could hear the lie in the measured words and pushed. "Dangerous to whom?" Aldrich's face went harder. "To the church, to the people. The geometry ties to rites judged unacceptable by higher authorities." "We obeyed orders." Matthias clicked his tongue and said, "We were told the bishop's council demanded removal of any such elements. We burned what we were told to burn." Elias stepped closer, so close he could see the tiny scar near Aldrich's eyebrow and the tight set of his left hand. "Who delivered those orders?" Aldrich looked away. The 2 stewards shifted, one placing a hand on the brazier to hold it steady. Then a third voice entered the corridor. Sister Imelda, cloak damp from the night air, candle smear on her sleeve. She moved without hesitation to the doorway and watched the men like someone reading a list. "Sister Imelda." Aldrich, his tone changed. Respect and a small fear threaded the sound. "You should not be here." Imelda ignored the rebuke and lifted a ledger from her arms. She approached the table and set it down closed and tapped the leather cover with a finger. "The cathedral has obligations," she said. Her voice had no flourish. It was plain and precise, the voice of someone who had delivered pronouncements that geometry is not mere ornament. It was deployed for a rite that binds a community at the foundation level. Higher men judged it dangerous and ordered suppression. Elias named the second emotion shift aloud, a stab of betrayal as the lodge fractured in his hands. He could not accept that the cathedral's ground had been made to hold a ritual unknown to the public, and that the same hands that cut stone would cut memory. Who judged it dangerous? He asked. Imelda met his eyes, the chapter of the bishopric. They feared disturbances to faith and social order. They instructed removal to prevent contagion of certain practices. Elias looked at Matthias. You burned drafts under their direction. Matthias bowed his head. I followed orders. I thought the ledger explained it, but I did not read every line. Jonas, still crouched, now folded his hands on his knees and spoke with a small, high voice. Aldricus the phrases. It would be safer for apprentices. He made us sign an oath. The revelation changed Elias's estimate of motive. What had begun as the lodge protecting itself now twisted into institutional self-preservation. Aldrich, do you keep a record of who signed the order? Aldrich hesitated, not beyond the chapter papers. Those are not for lodge eyes. Elias felt anger rise, but he kept it functional, measured steps and short demands. Then show me where the burned fragments came from. Open the sealed chest. Aldrich's hand closed into a fist before relaxing. He walked to a heavy oak chest in the corner and unlocked it with a small iron key pulled from a cord at his neck. The lid opened with a slow scrape. Inside lay charred strips, blackened scroll ends, and a pile of broken drawing tools. The stewards shifted to block Elias's view as Aldrich reached in. Elias moved faster. He grabbed for a streaked piece and found his fingers pinched by a gloved hand. A steward hissed, No, tomorrow, Aldrich, we will do this properly. We will not precipitate scandal. Elias answered with a short, hard sentence. Then let it be recorded properly. Let me copy what remains. Aldrich's face tightened. He barked, No, the chapter forbids outside copying. Words hardened into action. Aldrich turned and signaled. The cloaked masons moved as if a single organism. They lifted the brazier and set a new piece of vellum upon it. Elias lunged and seized a keystone sketch that had been half rolled and thrown toward the flames. Hands met his shoulder. A scuffle began. Now the chapter reached its designed pivot. Confrontation and physical contest. Elias shouted, Stop! And pulled as two masons shoved back. Matthias grabbed Jonas and shoved him toward the antechamber. Jonas tripped and clutched a hidden drawer, releasing it with a scrape. The drawer fell open and exposed a false bottom. Sheets nested within, some blackened, some merely sooty. Elias dropped to his knees and sorted through them. Beneath the soot lay a folded chart with a radial star, map and attached notations, coordinate marks aligned to carved stones in the nave. Jonas pushed forward and said, They us to hide those in case of inquiry. I put them here under the table. I thought only I would know. Elias felt a rush of both triumph and dread. The fragments, when assembled, spelled out a plan for a radial keystone whose central mark matched a carved glyph Elias had found under the western transept in his earlier search. This fits what I found beneath the cathedral. The keystone geometry would direct people's movement and perform a gathering at the center when the vault is lit in a certain way. At that moment the doors to the corridor creaked and Bernard, a steward who had stood silent until now, announced in a clipped voice, Master Aldrich, word from the chapter. They command immediate removal of all materials and closure of this chamber. Aldrich's face went white. He looked to Imelda. She nodded curtly. Then we must act. Elias slammed his palm on the table and spoke rapidly, forcing a string of short questions. Imelda, what was the rite's purpose? Who attends? Why did they demand erasure? Imelda gave a concrete reply. It was communal acknowledgement of bonds among master masons and the cathedral fraternity. The chapter judged it dangerously insular, a set of acts that could be misread as competing authority to the bishopric. They ordered removal to eliminate that separate locus of power. Elias felt betrayal deepen into resolve. He had not anticipated the political weight of the order. He had expected superstition, not sanctioned suppression. Then this is political. You are erasing a language carved into the stone because someone above fears a rival claim. Aldrich, you overstate the case. We guard stability. You are making accusations against us. Elias answered with evidence. He set the star map fragment beside the keystone sketch and traced the arc. This pattern was placed intentionally to produce a communal center. It is not decoration. It is a program. Aldrich snapped, and for a moment the lodge shook with raw anger. Tomorrow you force us into peril. Quiet this now. Take your pieces and go. Elias did not step back. He glanced at Jonas. Jonas, how many were burned? Jonas whispered, more than a dozen drafts in the chest. I pulled what I could. Matthias, he burned the others with his own hand. Matthias, who had avoided looking at Elias for most of the night, now stepped forward and spoke in clipped sentences. Aldrich ordered it. I did as I was told. I did not want to lose the practice, Elias, but I fear the chapter. Elias felt a complicated shift, anger into tactical calm. He moved to the chest and, with one swift motion, took the heavy lid and pried free a set of carved stones wrapped in oilcloth. One of the stones bore a glyph identical to the half-buried glyph he had found under the cathedral foundation. They smashed carved markers in the sealed crypt. Aldrich's face tightened into a horizontal line. He barked, "Enough. Open that crypt." A steward crossed to a concealed hatch and untied the rope. The crypt gate groaned as men pulled it open. Cold air spilled up like a poured liquid. The room smelled of damp stone and a dozen small fires smouldering in the antechamber where others had begun the task of burning carved fragments. Aldrich ordered, "Clear the chest. Move the rest to the crypt. Burn them there." Elias rushed the men, trying to save what he could. He grabbed a keystone sketch and folded it into his satchel. A mason shoved him aside, hands closed on his sleeve. The fight escalated into shoves and a single, sharp blow sent Elias against the wall. He tasted copper and grit and thought, briefly, of the scar near his eyebrow that tingled with each impact. In the vaulted crypt, Aldrich signaled cloaked masons to thrust remaining papers onto a brazier set in the center. The flames roared upward as men fed more vellum. Elias lunged for a rolled sketch and felt strong hands close around his collar. The steward who held him hissed, "You should leave." Elias twisted, elbowed, and managed to wrench a fragment free. Heat slapped his face. Someone struck his shoulder. He stumbled and fell. The fragment slipped from his fingers and smoldered at the edge of the fire. He reached again, fingers singed, and tore it free as Aldrich shouted and a steward raised a torch. 3 rapid lines of exchange broke from the men in a short, angry cluster. "Drop it! You will bring the chapter down." "Let him go!" Jonas cried out and pushed a mason back. Matthias shouted, "Jonas, run!" Jonas scrambled toward the stair and disappeared into the dark. For one brief instant, Elias saw the apprentices' faces in the crypt doorway, young, hollowed by fear, lit by flame, and he recognized how compliance had been bought with dread. Aldrich barked again and the masons sealed the crypt door. The blaze intensified, consuming vellum and the carved fragments left unwrapped. Elias cuffed smoke and dragged several smaller fragments into his satchel by reach alone. When the masons slammed the iron bar into place, the room oversaw a collapse into choking red, lit silence. Outside the sealed crypt, Matthias helped Jonas slip through a side passage. The apprentice's hands were scraped and his eyes wet. "Jonas, do not come back tonight," Matthias urged. Jonas nodded and ran. Matthias returned and stood with Elias at the closed gate, soot streaking his face. He offered nothing in words. His silence acted as both apology and confession. Elias sat at the drafting table in the dim hours before dawn and spread the salvaged fragments across the wood. He worked methodically. Charcoal marks, connecting radial lines, matching notches on the paper to chips in the carved stones he remembered under the transept. He had 2 distinct goals for the morning: preserve what he could and decipher the marginal cipher that might point to other concealed markers. The cipher proved stubborn. Elias folded a fragment under a lamp and read a marginal note in cramped hand, a cipher of letters and numbers that indicated compass bearings and stone names. He traced the sequence with a gloved fingertip, and slowly a pattern emerged. Coordinates that suggested a network of concealed markers in a ring beyond the cathedral's footprint. As dawn light softened the high windows, the last small tune of emotion settled into cold determination. Elias felt the final shift of the chapter's emotional arc, from suspicion to confrontation to bruised resolve. He had lost many drafts and carved stones to the flames, and yet he had recovered enough to show the deliberate architecture beneath the cathedral's face. He wrote with short, precise strokes, copying notations onto his leather notebook. He checked each name he had heard. Aldrich had followed orders from the chapter. Imelda had delivered the directive with an unblinking hand. Matthias had burned drafts under instruction. Jonas had risked defiance to hide a fragment. Bernard had delivered the chapter's command. Each man now bore a role in the erasure. Elias knew he could not reverse what had been reduced to ash, but he could map what remained and follow the cipher beyond the nave. He folded the assembled pieces and slid them into his satchel with careful hands. He fastened the strap and set his magnifying glass in its slot. He paused, listening to the building's bones. distant hammering, a bell rung once in the square, a cart creaking. These were ordinary sounds overlaying an extraordinary removal. A soft knock came at Elias's study door. He looked up, heart tightening in a practical way. He rose and opened the door. On the threshold stood Jonas. The apprentice's right sleeve was singed. His eyes had a new hardness. He held out a small folded slip and said in a low voice, "There's something else. I took it from a chest in the lodge when I left." I couldn't burn it. Elias took the paper and felt the weight of a new lead. He slid the cipher into his satchel and closed the flap. He did not promise safety or triumph. He simply, "Show me where you found it." Jonas stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The chapter's immediate battle, a chest of drafts, a crypt sealed on orders, a keystone sketch torn from flame had been resolved in grim terms. Men had followed orders. Some had lied, some had tried to save pieces. Elias now had a cipher and an apprentice who had risked everything to keep a scrap. He arranged the fragments under the lamp and traced a blackened line that led beyond the cathedral's footprint. The last paragraph ties to an action that pushes the story forward. Elias fastened his satchel, set the rescued sketches into the inner pocket, and followed Jonas's description toward a hidden ledger location the apprentice promised to show him, the latch of the study door closing behind them as they left for the next search. He lunged into the vaulted crypt and snatched a smoking vellum from the brazier before the flames consumed the ink. Suspicion tightened Elias Marrow's hands as soot flaked across his fingers. That suspicion had driven him into Mortar and into the cathedral months earlier when he pried a half-burned sheet from between carved stone. A mason pushed toward him with an arm raised, a masked face bent to shield the brazier's light. Elias did not hesitate. He pulled the fragment free and held it between thumb and forefinger while ash fell in a dim rain. He smelled the brazier and old wood, and the air carried the damp of the crypt stones. Around him, cloaked masons formed a half-circle. The hooded shapes moved like a single organism guarding a wound. Elias's throat tightened, but his hands stayed steady. He checked the edge of the vellum, charred margin, a smear of black where ink had run into ember. And in the torchlight he saw a partial curve of lines that might match the cathedral's keystone geometry. Suspicion was the first engine of his motion, but anger rose next when Matthias Kurz stepped forward and tried to wrench the sheet from Elias's grip. "Matthias, stop, Elias," stating the name as if it would call the man back. Elias felt his baritone edge into command because he needed the man's attention more than he needed quiet. Matthias hesitated, breath held behind a hood, and the brazier flared, throwing the man's silhouette across the vault. Matthias's voice came out small. "Elias, you must leave. This is not for you." Elias's fingers curled tighter on the vellum. He remembered the lodge door months before when Matthias had held a sheet to the flame. He remembered the moment he had wrenched that sheet away. That memory, concrete, burned, smell and all, had led him here tonight. The brazier spit. A younger mason moved to block Elias. Another tightened his grip on a bundle of sheets. Elias shoved the younger man aside. The shove left a sting along his palm and a bruise of embarrassment, but he reached the brazier and curled the vellum up from the heat. "Master Ruan, Elias." Turning toward the tall figure at the back, "Explain this." He used the name to cut through the murmurs. Master Ruan stepped forward with the slow deliberation of a man accustomed to commanding mortar and men. His face was lined. The scar along his jaw matched the tales Elias had read in guild records. "You should not have come, Elias." Ruan." He did not raise his voice. The words were a complaint and an indictment at once. These drafts were always meant to end here. Ruan's palm tapped the heavy ring at his throat, the signet that marked his office. The crypt's tension shifted when a thin voice answered from the doorway. Canon Alaric stood framed in the arch, his backlit silhouette drawing gasps. He had the church's robe over a plain wool doublet. His face was more severe than the carved apostles up in the nave. "Finish it," Alaric ordered. "Leave nothing that can undo our order." The command moved through the circle like a cold wind. Elias's anger quickened into disbelief. "Canon Alaric," he said, "you commanded this destruction." He stepped closer so his voice would reach the man without raising it. Alaric's reply was a measured breath. "The chapter cannot suffer another scandal. These drawings confuse worship with other rites. They sow danger. They must be purged." His hands were steady. His eyes did not leave Elias. The words were precise, but something in the way he said them did not match the small, almost desperate gestures Elias had seen on Alaric's face years before during a visitation. Doubt slid in, altering Elias's aim. Doubt replaced anger in the space between his ribs. He folded the vellum, pressing its charred edge to keep the ash from falling. The chamber smelled of iron and candle wax and the acrid tang of burning glue. He thought of the fragment he had found wedged in carved stone earlier that year, the one whose ink had smeared into a black streak when he first pried it free. That concrete action had led to tonight's pursuit, and now he feared the smear might be deliberate. A scuffle broke the tight silence. A cloaked mason lunged at Elias's elbow and knocked the corner of the vellum away. Elias swore and grabbed the man by the shoulder.
"Matthias!"
he barked. That single call had been the thread in their previous confrontations. It had stopped Matthias once when Elias snatched a burning sheet in the lodge. Now Matthias's hands trembled as he stepped forward and did not move to stop his fellows. Matthias spoke to Elias in a voice meant to be private. "Elias, listen. I cannot speak here." He slid his palm into Elias's and, without the others seeing, he pressed a folded scrap into Elias's hand under the sacristy. "Midnight. Come alone if you value it." He released Elias's fingers and turned his head away as though the brazier's glow had burned him. Elias felt suspicion flare into resolve. He kept the scrap in his palm and let his face register only wariness. He let Ruan and Canon Alaric see a man who would not be stopped by a rumor. "I will follow the evidence," Elias allowed. His voice had the scholar's cadence. It did not plead. He backed away from the brazier with the remaining vellum pressed close to his chest and left the cloaked circle to its embers. Outside the crypt doors the stairs smelled colder, and Elias's boots clicked on worn stone. He did not run. He moved with the careful gait of a man who had spent years tracing hidden lines and who did not want to jar a fragile clue into ruin. In the sacristy he found a narrow stair, and further down, illuminated by a single guttering candle. Matthias waited with his shoulders hunched as if protecting a secret. Matthias's eyes avoided Elias. He spoke quickly, whispering each word with staccato urgency. "They used to burn the drafts because people read geometry as scripture. They fear the pattern will supersede prayer." He pressed a thumb into an edge of vellum and produced a tiny chisel-marked map drawn in rough lines. "Look. The keystone aligns to a radial pattern that repeats in the foundation. The pattern is not only structure, it points. Someone drew it to aim at something under the nave." His words fell in short, sharp sentences. Elias took the chisel map and held it between torchlight and shadow. He could see the radial lattice, the same pattern he'd glimpsed once before in a scorched fragment. The concrete shape fit like a key into a lock he had only suspected existed. Why would they hide it, Elias? Matthias folded his hands. They were threatened. "Elias. Canon Alaric promised protection if we burned the drafts. Master Ruan, it would save lives. But I watched the brazier and I heard they meant to burn every last sheet." His jaw tightened. The man who had lit vellum to flames months earlier now rubbed his palms as if trying to erase the memory. Elias felt his suspicion widen into a layered fear. Fear not only of concealment but of a deliberate suppression of knowledge whose consequences he did not yet comprehend. He put the chisel map into his satchel and checked the vellum he had taken from the brazier. The scorched lines, when held to the candle, produced a near-complete sector of the radial lattice. They returned to the crypt on the pretext of confronting the circle. Elias wanted answers face to face, and he wanted Master Ruan to account for his actions. The crypt door opened with a slow grind, and Canon Alaric stood on the threshold again, this time closer, his robe catching the brazier's light. "Elias," Alaric began, "you cannot expose this. If you bring these drafts to the chapter, accusations will follow. Do you see what you would unleash?" His hands were open, not threatening, but his tone carried the weight of someone who had calculated a path and expected others to walk it. Elias did not drop his gaze. "Explain the intent, Canon. Show me the plan and I will judge its danger." He did not use supplication. He offered a measure of legalistic restraint, a historian's demand for evidence. Master Ruan intervened with a clipped breath. "Elias, you have the fragment. You saw the lattice. You also saw the marks in the foundation when you mapped the buttresses. This is not simple art. The lines guide construction and more. If the wrong mouths put name to those lines, unrest follows. You know the city. You know men will baptize the design into doctrine. Ruan's voice held practical sorrow. A rapid exchange of 6 short lines broke out, voices moving fast enough to feel like a lock tumbling. Master Ruan, name the threat, Elias. It was never a threat to the guild, Ruan replied. It was a threat to the chapter's order. Ruan's hand trembled as he tapped his ring. Canon Alaric promised protection. Elias, Alaric's chin lifted, protection for the Masons, for the faith. You are not the only one who reads risk into design, Elias. He stepped closer until his robe brushed the stone. Matthias cut in, voice sharp. No one gave consent to burn everything. I took one sheet for you because I could not watch it end. Matthias's fingers were dusty. He kept looking at the brazier as if it might reignite. Elias pressed the vellum harder. He realized then that the cathedral's original intent was not merely architectural, but intentionally ambiguous, designed to be hidden. The radial lattice repeated in subordinate stones, a private key left by artisans. Someone had ordered its erasure, that someone had mobilized both mason and cleric. Elias's next move was direct. He unrolled the largest intact fragment he had kept in a small leather tube and placed it on a flat slab. The fragment carried a partial compass rose, a faintly drawn axis, and a notation in a hand Elias recognized from guild marginalia. He pointed to a place where 2 arcs met a keystone seam. This meets the foundation here. Elias, if these marks remain unread, the stone speaks only of load and thrust. If they are read differently, they map a sequence. Who benefits from a suppressed code? His voice cut through the room. Silence pressed in for 2 slow beats. Then Master Ruan sighed. He ran a calloused thumb across the vellum as if to feel the lines. There are names written into the margins that are not Masons' names, Ruan admitted. Patrons who ordered sections carved in a pattern that echoes a city plan outside the walls. Those patrons feared cultic appropriation during the last famine. They the guild to hide the true lattice. The chapter feared a new order forming around the pattern. We burned the drafts to keep a fragile peace. Ruan's confession came without flourish. It was a ledger entry read aloud. Elias's doubt tightened into anger again. A piece made by erasure is a lie, he said. He felt his voice harden. This anger steered him toward action. You erased intent. You erased voices. You turned a shared design into an instrument of control. Who made that decision? Elias aimed the question at Ruan and Alaric both. Alaric's eyes narrowed. We did what we had to do. The city remembers how designs become manifestos. Men will rally to a symbol faster than they will to a sermon. We saved lives. His words had the cadence of someone who had done arithmetic with human lives and found the sums justified. Matthias swallowed audibly. We were threatened with ruin. We were told the chapter would cut ties, banish our families from guild work, take contracts away. Master Ruan signed for the protection. I signed for my son's apprenticeship. How could I not? His hands clenched into fists and then relaxed. Elias felt the emotional arc fold in on itself. Suspicion, anger, doubt, renewed resolution. He needed not only to argue but to act. He set a decision into motion by pulling the chisel map into view and saying, "Then we will not hand everything to you. We will hide what remains where it will matter, in stone where only a mason's eye will read it. Not erased, stewarded." His words were careful. They proposed a solution that preserved the design without publishing it. Ruan closed his eyes for a moment. "That is treason to the chapter," he said quietly. "It is stewardship to the guild and to those unknown patrons," Elias replied. "We will not hand the cathedral's soul to a single authority that fears its power. We will bury it with care. We will leave chisel marks as a private key. The design will survive as craft, not creed." Elias's plan had the directness of someone mapping steps on a drawing table. It was not rhetoric but procedure. Canon Alaric's face moved through an expression Elias had seen before in men who had calculated risk. The narrowing of options followed by cold compromise. "If you do this, Elias, you remove the chapter's recourse to intervene should others decipher the lattice. You make us vulnerable to future misuse. You would hide evidence from ecclesiastical oversight." He did not shout. He enumerated consequences. Matthias surprised them both by speaking fast. "Canon, Master, stop, listen. I cannot bear burning every sheet. I will hide them. I will mark the stones. Let me do it and keep my family safe." He looked at Ruan as if seeking absolution. Ruan's jaw worked. He studied Matthias and Elias and then nodded once. "We will not hand the last drafts to the chapter. We will steward them in the cathedral fabric and bury the surviving sheets. We will leave a private key known only to the lodge. But if the chapter or the city ever forces us, we will accept the sentence for the sake of the guild." Ruon's voice carried the weight of a man sealing an oath. Alaric closed the space between resolve and acceptance with a single concession: "I will not torch the entire record tonight. I will permit stewardship if the lodge swears secrecy, and if the chapter receives a false account, that a purge and a remnant ended the matter. That will protect the city and keep the design from becoming doctrine." He paused. "But if you reveal these drafts recklessly, you will have made enemies of the church and of the guild's patrons." The threat was plain, bureaucratic, and made concrete by the names of people and the consequences attached to them. The conclave dissolved into a flurry of hands and hushed bargaining. Some masons fled down side passages. Others collapsed to the floor and rubbed their eyes. Elias felt the climax of the night arrive in the heated exchange. Accusation, confession, bargain, and the turning of a ritual of erasure into a legal compromise. Voices moved in short sentences, overlapping, each line another nail in an uneasy pact. Elias moved among the men, placing surviving sheets into a leather tube supplied by Matthias. Every 3 steps some external event punctured the conversation. A mason slamming a chest shut, a sudden cough that revealed a burning ember, a boot-scuffing stone as someone left. These interruptions kept the energy jagged and kinetic. Elias folded the largest fragment and pressed it into the tube's depth. The lines remained visible under his thumb. The unexpected twist came when Master Ruon produced a name no one had expected. The cathedral's chief patron decades earlier, a merchant widow whose ledger in the nave had been annotated with the same marginalia Elias recognized. She requested concealment not out of piety, but to preserve a lineage of benefactors who feared civil war should the lattice be read as claim to territory, Ruon. She feared families would trace the design beyond stone and into land titles. The destruction was legal, not sacramental. It was a bargain between guild, patron, and chapter to keep property disputes from turning to blood. The revelation reframed the motive. Not merely fear of cult, but a political calculus. Elias had expected the chapter to speak of doctrine and cult. He had not expected property and inheritance to be the primary engine. The twist changed his understanding of earlier confrontations. The brazier had been a tool of legal containment as much as of religious safeguarding. Elias's suspicion now found a more complex shape. Motives crisscrossed across faith, commerce, and survival. Dawn came weak and grey. Elias and Matthias carried the tube of surviving drafts to a hollow under a buttress where chisel marks already existed as a private key. Elias pressed the leather between 2 stones and used a small mallet to pack mortar. His hands moved with practiced care. When the final stone settled, he tapped it and then left a deliberate small mark beside the seam. A short wedge stroke that matched the crude chisel map Matthias had drawn. They paused beneath the buttress in the pale light. Elias had performed an action that would keep the lattice alive for artisans, but out of clerical records. He had chosen stewardship over exposure. The decision was concrete. A sealed tube in mortar, a private key, and a pact sworn by guild men who feared their families' ruin more than their own reputations. Matthias exhaled in a sound that was half relief, half exhaustion. "I thought I would be a coward for burning those sheets," he said. "But hiding them felt like saving something that belonged to us. I wanted to make right what I did." Elias placed a hand on Matthias's shoulder. He did not offer grand consolation. He guided the man's hand to the chisel mark. "Then be the keeper, Matthias, guard the key. Teach one son the pattern and one apprentice to read the marks. Keep it within craft, not creed." Elias's instruction was practical, a sentence of steps to follow. They turned to leave. Elias's back hit the buttress and he felt the stone under his palm. As he sealed the last of the mortar, he noticed a faint new chisel mark near the seam, a shallow nick not made by the mallet. He frowned and knelt to examine it. The nick was crisp and fresh, cut at a slight angle, unlike his own wedge stroke. Someone had been here after them. A boot scuffed outside the buttress, the sound steady on gravel. Elias rose and peered into the dim aisle. He could not see a face, only the hint of movement near the nave. The presence was concrete. A left, overshoe print in mortar dust, a faint smear on his palm where the stone's damp had rubbed. He blocked off speculation. He recorded the physical facts. Matthias's voice dropped to a whisper. "Who else knows?" he asked. Elias studied the new mark with the same steady care he applied to fragile vellum. He did not answer with conjecture. He instead, "Unknown, but we treat the key as if watched. We assume a watcher. We act accordingly." His instructions were a plan of action rather than a vow. They left the cathedral as dawn brightened the buttresses outside. The city looked ordinary. Merchants setting wares, bells calling for morning office. Elias kept his hands full of concrete evidence, the folded fragment, the chisel map, the leather tube now sealed in his satchel. He had not burnt the drafts. He had not handed them to the chapter. He had chosen to steward what remained. The chapter's immediate conflict had been resolved by the pact in the crypt. Master Ruin had preserved the guild by bargaining. Canon Alaric had protected his chapter's authority through a staged purge. Matthias had betrayed and then aided Elias. Elias had converted suspicion into an act of concealment that maintained the cathedral's silent language. Each decision changed lives. Apprentices kept their positions, patrons' names remained out of public litigation, and the lattice lived inside stone rather than on parchment. Elias kept thinking of the merchant widow's ledger and the law that had birthed the bargain. The concrete motive, land and lineage, changed the moral frame. The drafts were not merely forbidden knowledge. They were instruments with social force. He had once believed the lattice was a relic of cultic practice. Now he knew it had been a practical tool folded into civic power, and the urge to erase it had been political as much as spiritual. As the day advanced, Elias made a list of tasks the way he would note fieldwork. Teach Matthias the key marks, catalogue the fragments the lodge had hidden, prepare a false accounting for the chapter that would satisfy Alaric, and most importantly, trace where else in the city similar chisel keys might exist. These were concrete next steps, each one an action that shaped future outcomes. Before he left, Elias returned to the buttress and knelt to feel the stone again. The new chisel nick caught the pale light and threw a thin line across his fingers. He recorded the fact in his field notebook with neat strokes. Fresh mark at foundation seam, unknown maker, assume observer present. Increased concealment measures, he closed the book and slid it into his satchel with the vellum and the chisel map. Matthias watched him with a look that mixed shame and a tentative hope. "Do you regret coming, Elias?" he asked. Elias paused for a count of 3, feeling the weight of the night settle into a choice. He answered without spin, "I regret nothing that preserves speech. I regret that the chapter chose erasure over conversation. I regret the harm that choice may have caused." His voice held neither triumph nor despair. It held the inventory of a man cataloging outcomes and responsibilities. They walked out into the morning light. Elias kept his gaze steady on the cathedral's silhouette. He had closed the chapter's immediate thread. The brazier would not consume every draft. The lodge and the church had reached a brittle accord. The cathedral's hidden language would live, guarded by chisel marks and by a few men sworn to secrecy. The final act was concrete. Elias sealed the tube. He left the chisel key. And he noted the fresh mark that implied a watcher remained. When he reached the square, he paused and looked back once more. A small figure moved at a clerestory window high above, too small to be distinct, but the motion was definite. Someone had not yet stopped watching. Elias tapped his signet ring and felt its weight. He slid the satchel under his coat and set his shoulders for the long study that would follow. Tracing the lattice, teaching the key, and guarding what he had rescued, he did not speak to an audience. He recorded and acted. He had turned suspicion into preservation, anger into negotiation, and doubt into a guarded plan. The last physical event of the chapter occurred when he sealed a fragment in the mason's hollow and found a fresh chisel mark beside it. That mark was the concrete echo that this conflict would continue, watched and contested. Elias closed the sacristy's heavy door behind him, the sound final and immediate, and walked away with the leather tube against his chest.